Hey, good Wednesday afternoon or Wednesday. I keep getting thrown a little bit because it is Wednesday and the sun is out. And so I'm like mad thrown because listen, I'm out of whack with the days, I'm out of whack with the time, I'm out of whack with everything. I don't from day to day. I don't know whether or not it's Tuesday, Wednesday. I don't know if it's 12 o'clock in the night or 12 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't know what is going on today. And so it's crazy. But listen, we here and I'm here. And so we are here on a Wednesday evening, and I'm usually here with you. Excuse me. And the other thing is my allergies are killing me today. And I'm trying to get through that as well. But we're gonna be good. We're gonna get through this thing. I may have to clip my mic off every now and then just to clear my throat so that you guys don't hear me clearing my throat. But allergies has really got me like locked up today. But anyway, so here we are. Gotta say good afternoon. It is afternoon where you are, Lamar. What's going on? Thank you so much for always supporting a brother, and for everybody else who is locking in right now. This is our continuing series in being parents in a Christian way. We are now in week 4. We're actually supposed to be in week 5, but the last lesson got a little long. And then I had to finish it last week and then start on this one. And what I've decided to do this week is just start from scratch from this new one, so that for those of you who were not listening to me last week can catch on this week with respect to this particular topic. And so it got good, and that's why I wasn't able to get through it. It was just the content was just like really out of control. And so let's get started, because I got a lot of content to get through tonight, and I'm excited about the content. Again, you are in the midst of a series, 6-week series called Being Parents in a Christian Way. And just because we're talking and using scripture to build a foundation on some of the concepts that we're talking about, any family can listen to this. Any family can glean from this. Any family can get tips from this, particularly in this time of this health crisis where, our family situations have been thrown out of whack all over the place, right? And so everybody's looking for answers, and everyone is trying to figure this thing out. And my hope was to be able to come on Wednesday nights to be able to share a little something and some trainings on some co-parenting things that we've done over the years in class style, but to really try to play this thing out in virtual style and see how it works. And I'm really pleased with the response from everyone over the last few weeks with respect to the work that we're doing. And so it's always cool. It's always nice to be loved and to be appreciated. So let's jump right into this. And so, in review, the first week we talked about parents as leaders and models, and the need for parents to be both leaders in their house and to be models in their house. The second week, we talked a little bit about children and the basic needs of children. Those two needs being our children want to feel like they are somebody, and they want to feel like they belong, right? And we talked about tips, and we talked about kind of ways to pay attention to how to activate your kids with the hope of making them feel always like they're somebody, but more importantly, like they belong. And then in week three, we came back to couples and parents, and we talked about how to begin to move forward to make this happen, and the family dynamics that need to take place in order for us to really have a healthy home, right? And so we talked about how parents had to be a team, and we talked about the importance of being a team. But then we talked about some tips and some ways to actually build your team. How do you build an effective parenting team, irregardless of whether you live together, you're co-parenting, you're long distance parenting, you're whatever parenting, part of the importance in parenting our children is that for moms and dads that we're team, that we work as a thing, we work as a team. And so this week we are into family change stages, and this one is an interesting one. It's kind of how why I got caught up in it, because this particular training is really kind of talking about how do we expect and deal with changes that take place in our household, particularly when we have blended families, change situations, things that like is happening now with this health crisis, and how do we adjust to family change. But before we go that way, I want to reiterate some of the foundational conversations that we had, so that if you didn't catch on to the first 3 weeks of our training, you at least know some of the foundation to which this conversation is building. And so we talked a lot about a healthy home and what a healthy home looks like. And we talked about a healthy home from a root perspective is covered in prayer. From a foundation perspective, is built on the foundation of faith. The walls of your home is literally the character and faith driven actions, means the things that you do in your home, right? And then, somewhat as a support to the roof, there's two principles that we have to adhere to in our households. One is that adults have to be in charge. Adults must be in charge as it relates to their households. We know that homes can become extremely chaotic when adults do not seem like they're in charge and children are running the house. And I said something last week about the inmates running the asylum, right? And so you can't have the inmates running the asylum. You got to run it yourself. And then there's this need to make room in your home for everybody to be both close and apart when those times are necessary, because everybody needs to feel like their home, and they need to feel comfortable in their home. But at the same time, they need a feeling of being apart from everyone, right? Finding their own space, their own quiet time, and things like that. And then one of the things that we're getting ready to deal with today, and that is to always expect change, that things in your household will not remain the same for several different reasons. And it's important for you to know that you got to kind of ride the change out, and you got to understand that things will change in your household. And there are things that you can do to ensure that you're riding with the change. But there are three kind of principles, and we're going to talk about them in an upcoming slide. But this particular week, we are talking about healthy change in the house. And every week that we do one of these, we ground it in scripture. This week happens to be Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1. There is a time for everything, a season for every activity under heaven, a time to cry, a time to laugh, a time to grieve, and a time to dance, a time to be quiet, and a time to speak up. Right. And so we know that there's a time for everything, right? And that I heard Dr. Miles Monroe say in a New Year's Eve service he did, and he talked about change, and he said there's three constants in life. I'm sorry, not three, two. He said there's two constants in life. The first one is that change will happen, and the second one is that time continues, right? So it's important for us to know that change is going to happen in your household, and you have to be prepared for the change that will take place in your household. And how do you build a household that allows you to be able to absorb that change and move forward, right? And so we also know that life needs a few constants, right? There's some things that have to remain in place in order for you to create a level of stability in your house. There's a scripture, Psalms 127, verse 1, that says, unless the Lord builds the house, its builder's labor is in vain. And basically what he's talking about is that there's a lot of things you can do on your own, but there are times that you're going to have to rest on God to provide you the things and insight and discernment and all of those things that you really need to run a household, right? And so that you have to have the ability to be able to listen to God when you are thankful and when you're running into situations. But the three constants that we need in our life is what I already talked about. The job of parents is to be leaders and models. That's your job, parent. Your job is to be both a leader and a model. Kids need to be recognized that they are someone and that they belong. And I talked last week about how you do that. And couples need to be a team, and they need to be constantly building their team, which means that they should be constantly paying attention to the household. They should be paying attention to the players, the rules, and all of those things that make up a great and strong team. And then there are two types of change, right, that takes place in the house. One is what we call transitional, and the other one is transformational. Transitional change occurs when we move from one state of being to another, right? We literally change from who we are to what we're going to be. And you can make rhyme or reason in the transition, meaning something is happening in your growth space around your spirituality. Something is happening physically, biologically, emotionally. Something is happening that you can explain the change, right? That's transitional change. The other change, transformational change, occurs through God's resources and through our cooperation. It means that God has something on our life for us to be, something for us to do. And some things are going to happen where we can't explain. And the only explanation for the transformation in our lives has to lean on God's desire for our lives, but in line with our cooperation with what he has designed for our lives, right? And so be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. When you begin to think differently, right? When you begin to think about your life and you begin to think about where you're going to go, and then you activate that thought by your tongue and you speak it into the environment, you speak it into the atmosphere, right? So that God can not only feel it in your heart, but hear it in your voice and see it in your mind and feel it in your heart, right? And so that's the transference of the things that we desire, but the things that we need. And then those things are always coupled into prayer, right? Really asking God for what it is we would like to have. And so that is how change occurs. But the general rules for change, right? And so there are some rules that we have to be mindful of when it comes to change. And the first one is that you should expect change. Change is always going to come, right? No matter what you do, how you frame it, where you put it, change is going to happen, so that you should always expect it. Second thing is that stress is a signal that change is needed, right? So whenever you're stressed in your life, stress is usually an indicator that something is wrong and something needs to change. It's kind of like, people say, or I always say, my spidey senses is off, right? Something is not right, or I'm a little stressed on anxiety. I have some anxiety about something. And all that means is that something is changing, that your body is giving you an indicator that something is changing and you need to pay attention to the changes in your life. The third thing is you should expect to feel resistance in you and others when you change. I was laughing today because I was on a phone call and there was a young lady who was talking about a training that she was doing today. And she said it was supposed to be a 2 hour training and she was teaching elderly folks. She was supposed to have been teaching elderly folks how to use Zoom. And she said the 2 hour meeting turned into a 4 hour meeting because she had to spend 3 hours of that time teaching them how to turn on the computer. And that was just so funny to me because it just reminds me of back in the day when we used to have VCRs and like our grandparents and our older folks could not figure out how to set the time so that they could tape their favorite shows. And they always had to have somebody come over who was a little more technologically, savvy that could actually do those things. And so it reminded me of that. But a lot of people don't like to succumb to change. And so they have resistance in change, right? We see that in leadership spaces outside of our homes where people want to hold on to leadership all the time. And so there's a resistance to that kind of change. The second thing we should know is that when change is occurring, that we should take one step at a time. And so to solve or to be able to get in step with the change and why the change is happening and what the change should be and how we should pay attention to that change. Trust that God will help make the needed changes for you, right? And so there's sometimes where we're trying to make change on our own and we want things to change and we want things to change our way, right? We don't want to wait on God's way. We have no patience to wait on God's way for something to change. And we have to kind of slow ourselves down to know that if we have faith in him, that things are going to change for the better for us, right? And sometimes we have not enough patience to sit through that kind of change. And the last thing is to use all your resources when you get stuck, right? And so sometimes when we're changing, we can become, again, impatient in sitting. And then we become, trying to think of the word, but we don't want to ask for help, right? We don't want to ask anybody for help, but we don't want to use all of our resources and our last energy to kind of get through change. One of the things I could think about when it comes to that is like when we're trying to lose weight, right? And so we want this, so losing weight, great illustration. So losing weight is a transitional change, right? Transitional means that you have to do something. You have to not eat as much sugar as you usually eat. You got to exercise. You got to go to the gym. You got to run. You got to walk. You got to create some movement. And over time, when you do those things and correct your eating habits and your exercising habits, your body changes from one state to another. That's transitional change. But what we want is transformational change. We want to be able to go to sleep and say, God, I want to be 50 pounds lighter tomorrow. And do you want to wake up in the morning and be 50 pounds lighter? It don't work like that. That's why it says that transformational change occurs through God's resources and our cooperation. It means that he's going to give us the means and the resources to be able to change. But in order to get that change, you have to do something to activate it. Does that make sense? I hope I'm making sense tonight in this space. And so here's an old adage, right? This is something that we've heard in several different ways, but I love it and I'll cite it to you tonight. If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always gotten. If you want something different, you got to do something different. It's normal to resist change, and it's important to find ways to push through the resistance, right? And so if you really, really want change, you really got to dig in and you got to push past the resistance. Again, when we talk about losing weight and we talk about that transitional change, there are times where you think you're doing the right thing, but then you flip up and you don't want to do the right thing and you want to fall off, right? But that's that point where you have to resist and not fall back into your normal ways, and you got to push even harder, and you got to push that Twinkie away from the table. You can't take, you can't do that. If you want change, you can't do the things you've always done. If you want your body to change, you have to do something different, because obviously the things you've done up to that point hasn't gotten you the result. Does that make sense? And so there are three essential skills when we begin to start thinking about family stages. And these skills have to be in place for all parents, but they also have to be in place for children when you are dealing with family stages. The first one is everybody has to speak. Somebody has to say something. Someone has to activate thought, and someone has to activate rules. And children need to be encouraged to speak, right? One of the things that drives me crazy is parents who are always telling their children to be quiet and shut up, right? Be quiet and shut up. Particularly if they're asking questions, right? If somebody asks a question, give them enough dignity to answer their questions, right? But you got to give them voice so that they understand how to use their voice. One of the other things that drives me crazy, particularly when it comes to boys, when you're talking to boys and they're speaking so low that you can hardly hear them, it drives me up a wall. It's kind of like, listen, boys, you gotta use your voice. Let me hear your Mufasa voice, not just Simba voice. Let me hear your Mufasa voice. And then I always ask myself, what have you gone through in life that has suppressed your voice so much? And who in your life has told you that your voice doesn't matter and that you shouldn't lift your voice? And so it's important to speak. The second thing, right? And speaking doesn't come without listening, right? And because that is the definition of communication. We speak to be understood, we listen to understand. That's the transference of communication. If you're speaking and the other person is not understanding, or you listening and you're not understanding, right? Or you're speaking and you're not being understood, and they're speaking and you're not understanding, and you're not taking time to make that happen, then you're not communicating, right? You're talking, you may even be arguing, but you're not communicating, right? Communicating takes the ability to be able to speak to be understood and listen to understand. And then you have to cooperate with the information that you have. And you can disagree, agree to disagree. You can give your points on why you believe what you're hearing is not true. You could even talk a little bit about why you may not be able to understand, reword what you're saying so that the person that's listening to you can understand, so that you can come to some resolve, right? And that is why it drives me crazy when parents don't allow their children to speak, because it does not give them the ability to strengthen those muscles around communication, right? I read a statistic some time ago. I wish I knew where I read it, because I read so much stuff, and it's probably just in passing. And it was talking about particularly African American parents as it relates to discipline. And they said that one of the reasons that particularly African American children, and more specifically low income African American children, struggle with comprehension and language and word development is because that their parents speak to them always in command and demand language. What is command and demand language? Command and demand language is stop, don't touch that, don't go there, don't do that, be quiet, shut up, go to bed, go to your room, eat your food. Is always in commands, and is never in full comprehensive language that gives space for communication, right? And we know how it is as an African American, myself growing up in a single family household and growing up around Black folks. I know command language. I grew up under command language, and it was one of the things that when I became strong enough to understand the importance of parenting, that I shifted that with my children, because I began to learn that if you don't allow them to negotiate in communicating with you, how do you expect for them to negotiate in the world? Right. And so when our sons are stopped by the police, if they don't have the communicative skills to be able to talk their way in that situation, and they say something out of their face that is in a demand or command form, that's the thing that's going to get them caught up. And so, why is not a bad question, right? If someone asks you why, they deserve an answer, even if it's wait, but never shut up or don't ask me. And that's how we were brought up. We were brought up that you don't ask and you don't challenge. You don't challenge grown folks. Children, grown folks is grown folks' business. Remember that? And so, as we go through these family stages, there are different kinds of tips that we should pay attention to depending on the makeup of your family. And so, that's what we're going to go through right now. But first, we're going to talk about couples, right? And we're going to talk about some tips for couples to use when their families are in transition. The first thing is to commit yourself to living cooperatively, right? And that means to negotiate, to talk, to communicate, right? There's nothing worse than two parents that don't communicate when it comes to raising their children, right? And so it's important that we, as we build our family, right, that we understand that part of building a team is that the team speaks to each other. That my teammate watches my blind spot, that my teammate pays attention to my weaknesses and my strengths, and that we work cooperatively together because we have one goal with our children and with our household. But you got to commit that to each other, right? And once you commit that, or make that commitment, then you're also committed to resolving problems. The reason that it is difficult oftentimes for us to resolve problems is because we don't commit to resolve our issues, right? And I know that was a lot for you to hear, but that is what happens. We don't commit to working as a team. And when you start arguing, that's an indicator that you got team problems, right? So secondly, for couples, make time and space to be a couple, right? So that you can begin to learn each other. You can begin to know each other. You can begin to work your communication issues out, right? As a couple. Like, don't test your communication skills in front of your children and in front of your family and in front of your friends, in front of your coworkers, via social media, right? I see people doing that, putting their family business out there. Oh my goodness, I'm not even going to go into that, but I've seen brothers cussing out brothers and sisters demonizing sisters, and children coming at their parents and parents coming at their children on social media. Are you serious? Right? So you got to give yourself some time and space, when you're in a couple, to be a couple, to give yourself the ability to be able to understand where your communication flaws are, right? You can be parents, and it's okay to be parents and being parents when you need to be parents, but you got to find some time and space to be a couple. Like, go on a date, go out somewhere where you don't have to worry about what's happening in the household. All you got to do is worry about what's in front of you, right? This is a huge one. Be less your parent's child and more your partner's spouse. And so what this is talking about is when you're actually disciplining and when you're setting rules in your household, that as a team, you're not active as two parents absent of being each other's partner. When you do that, you begin to lose respect for the other person, right? When you're working as partners, you're working and you're building on each other's strength and weaknesses, right? But when you're functioning as your child's parent, particularly in blended families, right? And we're going to get to that in a few slides down from here. But if you've ever been in a blended family, one of the first things you have to establish when you come into a household is, what's my boundaries when it comes to disciplining your child? because that child's not mine. Like, you have to give me the rules and the parameters to which I discipline that child. And then you have to always be able to help me understand when those rules are changing, right? And when do I have more leeway or when do I have less? Because there's also this other parent out there, right? Who's outside of the household, who's watching what's going on with their child and who that child is visiting and reporting on what's happening in the house, right? And so if you're not working together as parents, you give the child the ability to be able to pit things against you, right? And so you always have to be a team as it relates to being parents when you're in couples, right? This is also a big one. Help your parents and family to include your partner, right? So the scripture at the bottom says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And the reason that scripture talks about that is that no one on earth should be able or be in the position to divide you, especially when it comes to your children, right? So, yeah, you got to make the demand that you ain't got to like my spouse, you ain't got to like my partner, but you damn sure got to respect them. And there is nothing like being in a relationship and knowing that your partner's family comes before you. How do you live in a household like that? How do you live in a household knowing that if things break down or things go down, that you are not the second in line to thought and consideration when it comes to your partner, and more importantly, when it comes to your wife or your husband, right? That mama is all up in your business and daddy's all up in your business and grandmama and big mama and papa and your cousins all up in your business all the time, right? So as couples, if you want to be able to manage family changes, you got to be a team walking into this, right? And so then there are family stages as it relates to families with young children, right? Which is a very different nuance. And in this space, you got to make room for the child in the family. Like, the child has to, again, our children need to understand that they're special and that they need to belong. And so you got to make room for the child in the family. You got to give the child the ability to be able to shift back and forth, right? You set time with the parents, you set time with co-parenting, you set time with the grandparents, you set time with cousins. I remember when I was growing up, and even though I grew up in a single family household, every summer my mother sent me to North Carolina to spend time with my family. That's how I got to know my family, because she was very intentional that you got to know your family. Now, unfortunately, in that space, my dad wasn't in my life, so I had no clue about his family. So that was a family that there was no room for me in. But with respect to our own indigenous home life, my mother knew it was clear that she had to make room in my family for me, right? The next thing as parents in this situation is you got to take on both parenting roles and leadership roles. Those are different, right? Parenting is about taking care of your children and making sure that your children have everything that they need to be able to be all they can be, right? But leadership is about those traits you want to pass on to your children that allows them to function in the world, right? It allows them to be able, like earlier, I was talking about communication, being able to speak as a leader with command, using your voice, using compassion, right? Using truth, right? Using truth. So that when your child goes out into the world, whether it is in their classroom or otherwise at their job, they've not only learned how to parent, but they've learned from your parenting how to lead. And so children watch parents with respect to their leadership. You don't think that they're watching you, but they're watching How do you lead? How do you command? How do you even follow, right? So leadership principles is not always about how do you lead and command people. Leadership principles, for the most part, and oftentimes, is about how you follow too, right? Servant leadership, which is a whole nother training I want to do at some point to really kind of talk about how do you process being a servant leader. The other thing is you need to take the lead with your parents in negotiating how they will be parents, right? How they would be grandparents. Because, yeah, grandparents come in with all of the niceties and none of the responsibility, right? And so I get to, as a grandparent, let them, not go to bed when they're supposed to go to bed. Let them eat up all the eat up all the sugar in the house, allowing them to jump off the couch and swing off the chandelier. Well, some grandparents. But we ain't got no responsibility. And then when it's all over, we get to call the parent up and tell them to come get them. Come get your kids. Right. And so, but it's important to understand that as adults, we need to take the lead with our parents when it comes to negotiating how they're going to be grandparents. And then I talked about this earlier, save time for being a couple. That's always important across the board. And so now we're getting a little older, right? And so now we're talking about kids who are now moving into that teen space, and some tips and really kind of giving you the ability to understand the things you need to do to navigate changes in your family, right? And so the first thing is parents do need to work more cooperatively, which means that you got to strengthen up. Your game got to step up, right? Your game has got to step up when your kids get a little older, because they're getting smarter. They're getting more savvy. They're knowing what buttons to push. They're testing you. Remember that when we were coming up, parents, you always say, you tested me? You tested me? Right? And I didn't have this growing up, but I know a lot of my male friends in this process. One of the things that was a rite of passage for them is to see what would happen if they raised up on daddy, right? Because they getting a little bigger, they boys now. So one of the things, like when you look at little boys, right? Little boys are always trying to measure themselves up, right? They always like seeing if they tall, particularly with their parents. As they get a little older, they always, now they're playing on one hand, but they're measuring you up, right? And for boys, it becomes important with dads. Like once they get the same height, and if they get a little taller, they forget that that's your father, that you ain't going to win that fight. You ain't, what you looking at is you looking at physical ability, but you ain't paying attention to emotional motivation, which is he's going to do anything to win, right? Anything to win. And you ain't never going to rest until he does, right? And so because of all of that, we have to become a little more ready for our children as they become older, right? And then this hard thing, right? Making room for our teenagers to operate in and out of the family, because now they're beginning to step out of the household. And so there's this influential chain that we use in our curriculum that talks about particularly young children are taught and influenced by their parents and their teachers. Teenagers are influenced by their peers. So understand that. Young children are influenced by their parents and their teachers. Teenagers are influenced by their peers. Now, check out this transition to young adults. Young adults are impacted by their mentors. And their mentors usually come out of their own personal peer circle. So the kind of child, teenager they become and the kind of people that they hang around is more likely going to be the kind of people as they're going to hang around as they become young adults, which is why it's always important to know who your kids are hanging out with, right? But this is a change that many parents have difficulty with, right? Because their kid is becoming more independent and they want to step out and they want to do some things. And you got to let them go because you got to let them live and you got to let them make mistakes. But as parents, it's important that we give some and we pull some. We give some and we pull some, right? In order to allow our teenagers to operate both in and out of the household. And then gradually share more decision making and truth with your teen, right? So this is ooh, I'm gonna leave the decision one alone because you understand that. Teenagers need to begin to make their own decisions because they have to be accountable for the decisions that they make. But the decision to be more truthful with them. And so in this space that I'm in around responsible fatherhood, it's critical. So that now I'm being transparent because this is something that my mom did not do, right? With me as a teenager. Didn't realize that it was important until I actually made the point that it was important and she saw the body of my work. But where is daddy? Where is daddy? And in some cases, where is mommy? And particularly for adopted children, like where are my parents? Like there's some situations when they were younger that you don't want to give them full truth, but you want to give them age appropriate truth, right? You want to say to them, I'm not really sure where he or she is, but what I do know is that they love you. And what I do know is that they're thinking about you. And so as young children, that's enough. But as they get older, they want more information because they're trying to figure out why. And the more you withhold information from them, the more they're going to make you accountable for it when they finally learn the true truth, right? The true truth, not the made up truth, the true truth. And that's what happened with my mom and I. Now, she told me the true truth, but she didn't tell me the true truth until I was almost 40 something. And that made me feel some kind of way because she didn't understand the importance of me knowing the truth about my dad. And so it's important with our teenagers that we begin to start telling them a little more truth, appropriate truth that they can handle. You don't want to tell them all the gory details if you don't have to. But I will tell you this, if you hold it from them and they find out from some other mechanism and not from the source that they believe they should have heard from in the first place, you're going to have some problems. Guaranteed. Either, you're going to have some problems. And so couples need to be aware that you are refocusing on yourselves, careers, relationships, and aging parents, meaning that as our children are getting a little older, as couples and parents, we are also beginning to look at different things. We're beginning to see different things, right? We're beginning to focus a little different. Now we're beginning, our kids are about ready to leave the nest, right? And we're looking at our jobs as parents as, woo, I'm done. That child is out of my house. And now it's kind of like you sitting there and whether or not you're a married couple or you together or you're not together. But the minute those things begin to happen, now you're looking at yourself and you're trying to figure out what have you done with your life for you over the years that you were raising your child. And in addition to that, you're now looking forward to your own parents, if you're fortunate to still have them living, and you're beginning to shift as to, wow, what is my role now with my parents? Because that's another behavior that you have to teach. The way you teach your parents are going to at their mature ages will be the same way that your kids treat you. Again, they're watching you as leaders. And so now we're talking about adult children. And it's important to talk about adult children, right? Because we don't often talk about adult children. We think, one of the things, and I, always kind of talk to you a little bit about things that drive me crazy, right? And so one of the things I don't like, and I have a reason for not liking it, because it says something and that I wish that it didn't have to be said. And that is when parents who are paying child support pay the last child support payment and they treat that like a celebratory milestone. And I know and I get it. Listen, I'm not naive enough to understand what you're celebrating. But the messaging in that is that you can believe that your obligation to your child is over, and it's not. So celebrating that is not a milestone for me. It wasn't a milestone with me, and I didn't pay traditional child support. I did not pay traditional child support in the child support system. I paid child support, but it was agreed upon child support that her mother, I mean, my child's mother decided that, yeah, we were going to do everything 50-50, but I understand that there's some other expenses that I just want to help out with. And so as a result of that, we just came up with a number, and that was the number I gave her for years and years and years and years and years and years. And it's just come up recently that, our child is now 21 years old. She's now starting her business and she's now moving on. She's moving on into her adult life. And my thing is like, okay, we don't need to do this anymore. But just because I said we don't need to do this anymore, neither one of us believe for 1 minute that financial obligations with our daughter was over. Some point she's got this business. At some point she's going to want to get married. At some point she's going to have a child. At some point she's going to want to buy a house. Like, it never ends. And it kind of bothers me when people finalize their relationship in a celebration, like, finally I'm released from that obligation. But I understand that what they're really saying is I'm just released from that person, right? But I can't understand how after 18 years you cannot and could not have found one way to get along with that person. That just bothers me. And so that's my soapbox opera for the night. But anyway, with adult children, children become more involved away from family than within it. That's obvious. When our children get older, their life is their own. They're into their own thing. They're outside of the house, and they're not into, family things as much as they used to be, right? Adult relationships develop between parents and grown children, meaning that we no longer have relationships that look like parenting relationships. When our children get older, we have more personal relationships with them. We talk about deeper things. We discuss deeper things. They start to do things that you would never allow them to do as a child. Parents drink with their kids. Parents let allow their kids to cuss around them, which we couldn't do. We couldn't even do it when we was grown. So, but you loosen up. You'll sit and you'll watch an R-rated movie with your kid, or you'll, talk about, relationships with your kid. You'll do things with adult kids that you won't do, that you did not do when they were younger. And so that's one of the changes that happens and occurs, like when your children become adults. And then for couples, typically what happens is, again, I said before, that we take our eye off the prize of our children, and then we begin to look at ourselves. And that is typically the time that parents begin to start looking at ourselves and begin to celebrate what they accomplish with respects to their children. And so they begin to want to renew their commitment to each other. It's kind of like, man, okay, last time we got married for this reason, but now that reason is over, let's relive that. Let's get remarried for another. Now let's get remarried for us, with no kids in the house and no prospect of any other kids coming in our house, right? And let's have some fun with each other. And so that is a cool thing. I'm looking forward to that. And then there's these special family stages, right? There's these nuances. There's some other things out there that I want to run quickly through so that I can get through this particular training. And so there's also these tips for divorced co-parents, right? And so, and these are changes that occur that we have to be ready for, right? And so, and I just talked about this, the spousal agreement ends and the co-parenting remains. And we have to be mindful that just because our children have grown older, that we still have a responsibility with them, right? And so, and in addition to that, the child continues to keep ties to both parents, whether they live together, not live together, live across the street to each other. The relationship between the child and their parents is not going to end unless it was a relationship that wasn't solid in the first place, and that each parent is in charge of his or her own household, right? I'm sorry, but I told you my allergies are killing me and I'm really fighting through this, but my throat gets dry too. But for divorced co-parents, like each parent at that point when children are gone, they're in charge of their own household. They're not paying any agreements. They're not doing anything. They get to live by their own rules. And the house is a, new Disney World for those parents. And then there is stages as it relates to single parenting, right? With no co-parent. And for these parents, they remain in charge. Their relationship doesn't change much with their child. Oftentimes, when their child gets older, their relationship even strengthens a little bit, right? Because now they become more adult friends. They become and remain parents, but they become more adult friends. Right? And so co-parents in this space stay in charge, right? And also at this point, when as it relates to adapting to changes, one of the tips for being able to manage changes in your household is to rely heavily on consultants, right? People around you, wise wisdom, right? Not friendly advice, not unsolicited opinions. We're talking about wise wisdom, right? That's going to help you manage being a co-parent, right? And going to help you walk through the stages of changes in your life as it relates to being a parent. And you should have at least one close adult friend, somebody who's I remember a good friend of mine in Albany, New York. She's passed away now. Good friend, Brenda Brooks, said to me to always make sure that your relationship has friends. And at first, when she said that, I didn't understand what she meant. But what she was saying is typically people have friends that look out for them and not necessarily invested in the relationship. But you have to have friends and an accountability circle that has a vested interest in your relationship. And you want close adult friends that are willing and that you have given the permission to tell you when you're wrong and respect that wrongness and take the wisdom that that person is giving you and correct your course, right? And then use adult household members as advisors and helpers, not as co-parents. Don't hire and don't inspire anyone outside of your family circle to serve as a co-parent for your children. Like your child has two parents, right? And so discipline, where you advise and where you give leeway to discipline is one thing, but never, force a child to believe that someone else is serving as their parents. And then as it relates to step parents, right? Parents got to commit to the new partnership, right? That's a change. And this is something that I'm actually going to do a whole training about in about 4 weeks, right? Because when I saw this, I was like, this thing right here needs this whole hour, if not more. Parent commitments to new partnership. And y'all know what that is. New person comes in and you got to give space to the new person and you got to be able to ride that change. But more importantly, that person has to know and understand that they're walking into a relationship to which they're going to have to conform to, right? And so child has access to both parents and grandparents. We know all of that stuff in step families. And this is why I want to gloss over this real quickly because many of you kind of already know this, right? But here's one thing that I did not know that was statistically sound. And that is it takes a minimum of 2 years for a new form of your family to take place. meaning that if someone comes into your life, it takes almost 2 years for everybody to get used to that person, which is why it creates so much dysfunction and chaos when people come in and out of your life, in and out of your life, in and out of your life. If you're dealing with somebody, if you happen to be in a step parent position, and you're dealing with somebody up front that you don't believe is going to be around for the next 2 years, if not more, you should cut them loose now, because all you're going to do is create a bad memory for you and a non-memory for your kids, right? And so adults in charge, we know all of that stuff. And so here's something that helps stimulate healthy change. Here are just some rules that you should just rely on as it relates to special rules and stimulating that kind of healthy change. Read your Bible and pray on a regular basis, right? Use your church family. We just talked about that. Involve yourself in friendships. Like, just, acquaintances are nice. You got acquaintances. You got them at work and you got them at other spaces, but you need friendships, people that you can develop a relationship with, that understands you, that you don't have to say everything, quote everything, and pour out all your information for them to understand how to help you, right? And use your social network, use your people who are around you at appropriate times, because this last bullet point is extremely important, and that is, don't strain your relationships. Like, nobody wants to be called every time you have a difficulty. Like, every night you calling the same thing. So and so did this and so said that. That person who has the time to sit and listen to you complain all the time is a person who's not interested in your solution. They're only interested in your drama, right? Do what you will with that one. And so you're ready now. I gave you a bunch of tips to be able to kind of walk through your life and really understand, how to make this happen and how to move this thing forward. And so my offering to you is that, in order to keep this stuff moving and to overcome and to navigate change in your relationship, is just to pray, to pray to God and ask for the ability to recognize when we need to change, the willingness to have an open mind and heart to the possibility of change, the strength to ask for the ability to change, and especially the spiritual maturity to conform our will to God's desire for us individually and as a family. And so that's a prayer for you. And so come back to this, take a screenshot of that, put that up on your refrigerator, and always remind yourself that you have to do that. So here's a piece of homework for those of you who have listened to this whole thing. And I thank you all so much for listening to me tonight. Again, this is going to be a norm for me on Wednesday nights. Really helping God is just putting on my heart to help parents parent. And so I'll be, talking across the board as it relates to, and getting a little more specific in some areas as it relates to parenting. But tell your children a story, about an important time in your childhood of a time that you and your family was going through, right? And make sure that the story is a successful one. There's a great outcome, and talk about how you managed that, and talk about how you navigated that, and talk about the outcome and how you felt about the outcome on the other side. So start beginning to set yourself up to have these kind of storylines with your children. And so next week when we come back, we are going to start with part 5, and part 5 is working together to solve a problem. Right. And so for those of you who got problems in your family and you trying to figure out how to solve those problems, next week I'm going to have a whole hour worth of stuff that's going to help you figure out how to work together and how to solve those problems. Be mindful that we have a free resource on our Gentle Warriors Academy page on co-parenting during a crisis. Make sure that you go and check out that particular resource because it really is a great resource. And so I do have one other thing that I want to talk to you about, and it's taking place tomorrow, right? And so let me kind of grab it for you real quick. And so it takes place That's the wrong one. There it goes. It's taking place tomorrow night right here on my Facebook page. And we are going to tackle the conversation of fatherhood and racism as it relates to Ahmaud Arbery. And it's something that's like been on my heart. I did a whole 1 hour Facebook Live yesterday to release all of the stuff that I had in me in talking about him. So for tomorrow night, I can sit back and let these gentlemen just kind of talk and share their heart as it relates to the whole concept of fatherhood and how fathers can play a role in teaching their children about compassion and respect for others, but at the same time, particularly for children of color, helping them understand that there is a racist element in our country that they have to be mindful of. And for cultures that are not us, that are not ours, how do they and how have they spoken to their own children about what has transpired to change and cultivate their hearts so that they don't engage in those kinds of activities and behaviors when they become adults? And so I'm happy about that. Got some great guys that are going to be on a call. My friend John Badalamet, David Miller, Coach Charles Sharper, Justin Batt, Sean Dove, and Bishop Darren Ferguson. And so we're going to be on a Zoom call tomorrow night right here on my page. We'll probably post it on a couple of other pages. It starts at 8 o'clock. And we're going to go to 9:30, and we're just going to have a comprehensive conversation about this issue of racism through the lens of fatherhood. And so thank you so much, and allow me to ride through my nasally nose and my nasally tone for this last hour. I'm going to leave you like I always like to leave you. Always be kind to others as you're kind to yourself, or you might find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And as my good friend Art Mitchell and mentor used to always say to me, it's nice to be important, but you know what? It's much more important to be nice. Until tomorrow night, I love you, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. Peace. You know, today we are overwhelmed by issues that cry out in civil unrest. As adults, we're so caught up in our own concerns that we don't even realize sometimes that children are aware. And you know what? We often don't even know how to explain what's taking place. We have a great children's book called Daddy, There's a Noise Outside. The story begins when the two children are awakened by noises in the middle of the night outside of their window in their inner city neighborhood. Daddy, There's a Noise Outside breaks down this complex issue of protesting into an easy conversational style that first graders and fourth graders can understand. Make sure you check out Daddy, There's a Noise Outside. You can find us on Amazon as well as our online store at www.fistoreonline.com. Pick up your copy of Daddy, There's a Noise Outside today.
Why should I care about the 2020 census?
Our numbers help shape funding and services.
For all these things.
That's a lot of stuff.
No matter who you are or where you're from,
we have reasons to care.
Shape your future. Start here at 2020census.gov.
Why should I care